Order, order. Welcome to this evidence session for the Home Affairs Select Committee as part of our regular sessions on the work of the Home Office. And we welcome before us today Matthew Rycroft, the Permanent Secretary of the Home Office, also Charu, Gorasia, the Director General for Capability and Resources at the Home Office, and Shona, Dunn, the Second Permanent Secretary at the Home Office. Welcome to you all. We want to cover a series of issues this morning, including the issues raised by the Wendy Williams report into the Windrush scandal, but also some of the issues around facing the Home Office around the Covid-19 crisis and others. So we're going to start with the Covid-19 crisis. We'll start with Dehenna Davison.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for taking the time to be with us today. Clearly, the pandemic has had a huge impact right across our society, and clearly that impact's hit the Home Office too. So what analysis has been undertaken within the department to look at the impact of COVID on departmental income, demand for passports and visas, and business as usual? And if you could touch upon staffing levels particularly, that would be really appreciated. So Ms Dunn, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. So on the passport point, so obviously across a whole variety of departmental services and functions, there has been a significant impact of COVID-19. We've had a significant drop in many of our visa streams. We've had a very significant drop in passport application numbers. We have had, on the reverse side of that, if you like, some increase in demand on the asylum side of the house and the numbers there. With passports, numbers have dropped very significantly. In the first few weeks of the COVID response, we also, in terms of staffing numbers, had to take our staffing numbers down very significantly. And I think the last time I was in front of the committee, I mentioned that we were keeping going emergency and compassionate cases. I think we at that point had processed something like 570 emergency and compassionate cases. We are now back up to processing around about 57,000 cases, applications for passports a week. That is at the moment around about a third, I think, of the numbers we would normally be processing. We've had the HMPO in particular is one of the services of the department where we have had many staff in throughout the COVID process. So we have done that very, very carefully. We've thought very deeply about how we make sure we make that working environment safe for our colleagues. The numbers have gradually been increasing, coming in. I think at the moment we have got, to the best of my recollection, about 80% of people back in. That obviously varies dramatically across the department. So I think in some policy and strategy functions, we've only got around 5% of our staff in normal workplaces. In some operational functions, obviously far, far more.
Brilliant. And Mr Rycroft?
Well, just to add that it's not just those issues that affect the department. Really, all of the work of the department, and indeed across the whole government, is affected by the COVID pandemic one way or another. So, for instance, when we look at policing, very significant role of the department has been working with our policing colleagues as they work with the public to educate, explain, engage with them, and then, if necessary, enforce the regulations. That's just one example. Bringing in the public health measures at the border is another, and it was the Director General from the Home Office who set up the Joint Biosecurity Centre, so that's a third. So very significant engagement of the Home Office in a cross-government agenda led by the Home Secretary in all of the regular governance structures and meetings that you would expect.
Brilliant. And Ms Gorasia?
Thank you. So on top of what both the PERMSECs have already mentioned, I would also point out that there have been significant impacts of COVID-19 on additional costs, as Ms Dunn was saying, around asylum, but also around policing and costs of PPE provision, as well as additional overtime costs. So there are impacts around finances, and in terms of staffing, we have got about 65% of our staff currently working from home, and we are phasing the return of those who cannot work from home over the next few weeks in line with government guidance.
Many cases of sort of staff moving around the department as different work streams have been prioritised.
Can I also ask, because obviously we want to cover a series of issues, that we're going to direct, I think, all of our questions to the Permanent Secretary and ask Mr Rycroft if you could then refer them to your colleagues as well if needed to, so we can get through as many as possible.
Of course, Chair, thank you very much. So the question on the staffing, so yes, there are examples of staff moving around the department in order to meet high priority needs. And there are also examples of Home Office staff being deployed to other government departments. So for instance, very early on in the COVID pandemic, our DWP colleagues had a requirement for additional operational staff. And I'm very glad to say that many members of the Home Office were able to become very quickly retrained and to provide that function for our colleagues.
Brilliant. And then just one more question from me. Clearly there's a huge recruitment drive for policing. How much has the pandemic impacted that recruitment drive?
So you're referring to the 20,000 uplift programme, which is a significant manifesto commitment of this government. I'm glad to say that for now, that programme continues to be actually ahead of schedule. Obviously that is being tracked extremely carefully, and you're right that COVID has an impact on that as elsewhere. But for now, ahead of schedule, and the recruitment numbers are doing extremely well. We're of course interested not only in the numbers of additional police coming in to our police forces around the country. We're also interested in, for instance, the diversity of those new recruits and other police improvement measures.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Rycroft, the UK has pursued a different approach to border policy throughout the pandemic than many other countries. To what extent have Home Office officials been involved in the consideration of scientific advice from the SAGE committee during the crisis?
Thank you for the question. As you would expect, Home Office officials have played a central role in helping advise ministers on all aspects of the COVID response that are relevant to the Home Office, including, as I mentioned earlier, the border. So in relation to the public health measures at the border, Home Office science advice and Home Office policy advice has been an integral part of that process. The Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor, who of course has given evidence to this committee, Professor Aston, has explained in detail, I think, his role and that of his colleagues, and that role continues. You know, this pandemic is not over by any means, and we need to make sure that as the government response goes into different phases, that the Home Office continues to be joined up, and I'm glad to say that it is, in terms of Professor Aston meeting a member of SAGE, in terms of the second Permanent Secretary and myself taking part in Permanent Secretary meetings. There are all sorts of other measures all sorts of other governance structures where the Home Office is playing a full role. That's all at official level, and at ministerial level, of course, the Home Secretary sits on all of the relevant committees.
Thank you. And in relation to the decision on the 13th of March to withdraw guidance advising individuals arriving in the UK from specific countries to self-isolate, can I ask what specific advice was sought to inform that decision?
That was before my own arrival in the Home Office. I think that we have given evidence previously to the committee, but can I give the second Permanent Secretary an opportunity to add to that?
Thank you very much, Matthew. So I think as Professor Aston has explained, the position on the 13th of March, where the guidance was removed, was because that was the point in time when the stay-at-home guidance came into effect for all people within the country, regardless of whether they were already in the country or coming into the country. And so specific guidance with respect to self-isolation for people coming in from particular routes was no longer regarded as being appropriate.
Sorry, Ms Dunn, I'm going to stop you there because that advice came in on the 23rd of March, 10 days later. So that's a gap of 10 days. So it can't be because the stay-at-home advice came in, because there was a gap of 10 days. So what specific advice informed that decision?
So that decision was informed by the work of SAGE and the scientific advice that was available at the time, which had been contributed to by Professor Aston.
So there was specific advice sought from SAGE and that was what was behind the decision to withdraw the guidance to self-isolate 10 days before this blanket stay-at-home guidance came in.
The advice that is available that supports the decisions that have been made, I think, has been published, so you have access to that advice. The decisions that were taken at the time were based on advice coming out of the scientific community associated with SAGE, and Professor Aston was very closely involved with that.
Okay, thank you. And have you ever requested estimates of the number of people entering the country who may have had COVID-19 at a given time? And have they been routinely provided to you?
So again, I think you have seen with the advice that has been published and with the summary of scientific evidence that Professor Aston relayed to the committee, that advice has been based on the 0.5% figure. Professor Aston has explained why that figure, why we have relied upon that 0.5% figure rather than converting that into an absolute number figure.
Thank you.
So I'm quite puzzled about what you've just said, because I can't see any detailed SAGE advice or evidence before the 22nd of March, which was a Home Office paper to SAGE on the 22nd of March. That is a full 9 days after the Home Office decision to lift the self-isolation guidance on the 13th of March. So can you just clarify, what was the advice? Was there specific advice? Did it come from the Home Office or from SAGE before the decision on the 13th of March to lift the self-isolation guidance?
The decision on the 13th of March was made when the incidence in the UK had increased and the stay-at-home guidance to everyone in the UK, regardless of whether or not.
Okay, the lockdown was announced on the 23rd of March. So
the stay-at-home message, Chair. So I think, Chair, I should give you a day-by-day. If it would be helpful for me to do so, I know Professor Aston has already set some of this out. If it would be helpful for me to set out a day-by-day account after the committee, I'm very happy to do that. The 13th of March decision was based on advice and discussion which Professor Aston was involved in as part of SAGE, which related to the point in time where everyone was being advised to stay at home.
Well, actually, everybody wasn't being advised to stay at home on the 13th of March. That advice came in on the 23rd of March. And look, I have a real concern about this because we have been pursuing these questions for some time. And at the moment, we can still see no evidence that there was any scientific advice sought in the run-up to the decision on the 13th of March to lift self-isolation guidance at a time when there was still a very high prevalence in Italy, still a very high prevalence in Spain, still a lot of flights coming into the country from Italy and Spain. It's obviously not your decision what the policy conclusions are from this, but we're still trying to understand whether there was any scientific advice behind that, whether the Home Office asked for any scientific advice, whether the Home Office did its own assessments. And you're still not providing us with those answers.
The Home Office decisions, Chair, were based on and underpinned by scientific discussions in which Professor John Aston was involved as part of SAGE.
But there's no minuted discussions of this. There's in all of the SAGE minutes, there's no evidence that there was any discussion of this at all. That's why I'm asking, was there a detailed scientific discussion within the Home Office? There clearly doesn't seem to have been in SAGE at all on any of this. So the Home Office look at this.
The Professor Aston absolutely was involved in those conversations, and I...
Which conversations?
What I do is I ask Professor Aston to give an account of the days in advance of the 13th of March to you after this committee meeting in detail. Clearly, the material he's provided so far has not given you that day-by-day account. I'm more than happy to ask Professor Aston to provide that, Chair.
Okay, did you as senior officials see the evidence from SAGE?
The senior officials involved in that decision and ministers will have had access to all of the advice from and to SAGE at that point, yes.
Okay, and just to clarify the point that Ruth Edwards raised, did you at any point ask for an estimate of the number of people coming into the with COVID-19?
We have never had, to the best of my knowledge, an absolute number estimate. So Professor Aston has explained the way that calculation was arrived at, the 0.5% was arrived at, which was looking at prevalence in certain countries and comparing that with prevalence in the UK and reaching that percentage estimate. The reason he has frequently said that it was important to stick with a percentage estimate rather than an absolute estimate was because the level of uncertainty on both sides of that equation made it important that it was a percentage rather than an absolute number, and we have continued to operate on that basis as Professor Aston set out.
But your paper from the Home Office to SAGE on the 22nd of March specifically says that a relevant consideration will be the number of cases with COVID-19 coming into the country. It doesn't say the proportion in that paper, it says the number. Mm-hmm. So did you at any time ask for an estimate of the number, even if you had scientific advice that there were alternative figures as well? Did you at any time ask for an assessment of the number of people who might be coming into the country with COVID-19?
I'm not aware that we did, Chair, but I'm more than happy to confirm that after the hearing.
Okay, that would be really helpful, because I have to say it is really baffling as to why you wouldn't ask for that information, even if you then weighed it up in the balance of other information. I just find it really odd that the Home Office isn't seeking crucial evidence like this.
Chair, of course, just what I would go back to is Professor Aston's evidence that the uncertainties around the number are very significant.
Of course, so I would simply say to you the uncertainties around all of these figures are all obviously very significantly high. But we have also, to be aware, we have also taken evidence from other countries who have said that that figure about the proportion is not the right one that you should be looking at, and instead you should be looking at the number. Can I ask you now, in terms of your assessment going forward about whether there should be air bridges, whether there should be future quarantine arrangements and so on, have you asked for an assessment from within the Home Office, from SAGE, from anybody else, about the number of people who could be arriving from different countries with COVID-19 if quarantine arrangements are lifted?
So, Chair, that works. Of course, the Home Office continue to input to the work of SAGE, and that will continue to inform the decisions that are made. The decisions that are made around the lifting of various restrictions are decisions that are being taken forward by the Department for Transport, but we will continue to input to those. The question about absolute numbers going forward, again, the work that will be done will look at prevalence in various hotspot countries, but okay. I know DFT will want to give you a fuller answer on the range of factors that they will consider.
Okay, I'm really struggling with this. I know it's not your responsibility to make the policy decisions, but I'm still interested in what analysis the Home Office commissions and what evidence the Home Office commissions in order to feed into decisions to make sure they are informed. Are you telling me that nobody has asked for or estimated the number of people who might arrive from different countries if quarantine regulations are lifted over the next couple of months?
Understanding of prevalence in other countries is absolutely a factor.
But what about estimates of the number of people arriving with COVID?
I do not believe that anyone has asked for that number to be pinned down, given the range of uncertainties that are being dealt with. But as I said, Chair, I'm absolutely very happy to make sure that we can confirm that after the hearing.
Okay, I find that quite baffling. Okay, we want to turn now to the issues around the Windrush scandal and the Wendy Williams report. Stuart McDonald.
If I could first ask a couple of questions about COVID in relation to asylum accommodation. Could I ask, Mr. Rycroft, when did the Home Office know that mayors were going to move over 300 asylum seekers from serviced accommodation into hotels? And what steps, if any, did the Home Office take to assure yourselves that that was an appropriate move? Was this part of a sort of contingency plan?
Thank you for the question, Mr. McDonald. It's rather hard to hear you, but I think we did get the gist of that, and I would invite the second permanent secretary who oversees this part of the department to answer it in detail. But let me just say, first of all, that obviously we work extremely closely with MEARS and our other service providers in the provision of asylum seeker accommodation, and we are in extremely regular contact with them over decisions such as that you've got.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. The decision from MEARS to move asylum seekers from a type of temporary accommodation serviced apartments in Glasgow into hotels was a decision that was made, apologies I haven't got the exact date in front of me, but it was a decision that was made at a relatively early stage in the lockdown period, and MEARS made that decision based on their ability to be able to offer the appropriate services to service users during the lockdown period.
But did you satisfy yourself that the reasoning was sound? Because, for example, I don't understand why they moved people from serviced apartments, but folk on exactly the same type of support living in self-contained flats were not moved. When did the Home Office know about this, and what oversight or involvement did you have in checking that this has been done appropriately?
So MEARS did keep the Home Office and my colleagues in asylum support closely in touch with their decision making, and I know that colleagues in asylum support absolutely were involved in and understood the reasons for that decision. In addition, I have to say, on the specifics of individuals, I know that MEARS did look quite carefully with respect to each individual as to whether it was the right decision for that individual, and the question about whether the most appropriate support could be provided was taken on a case-by-case basis.
Well, what evidence have you seen from that? Because I'm afraid I have the distinct impression that MEARS tells the Home Office what it's doing, and the Home Office accepts that that's what happens. Is there any documented risk assessment of individuals? Because the impression I get, and MEARS' version of this changes with every week it seems, is that it was done on the hoof when they virtually turned up at the person's property and decided, is this person vulnerable or not? Is there any documentary trail as to the assessments that they made? Because that's a contractual requirement, as I understand it.
So the decisions, obviously, given the position and the circumstances around lockdown at the time, were inevitably made quickly. They were obviously part of the discussions that took place on a regular basis through the Glasgow partnership, which involved Glasgow City Council, which involved MEARS, which involved the Home Office.
Well, but MEARS do this as well. They casually drop in reference to partnerships and councils, but the council say that it had absolutely no role in deciding that this was an appropriate response. You say that this had to happen quickly, but the Home Office knew for 3, 4, 5 weeks that lockdown or something like this was likely to happen. Was there a contingency plan as to how asylum accommodation should be handled? Was moving folk from serviced apartments into hotels part of a contingency plan?
So there were a significant amount of contingency planning undertaken and discussions with service providers to make sure that they were ready to implement contingency plans and were
able to see that plan?
Service users in different circumstances.
And can we see that plan and what it said about moving people into hotels?
There will have been extensive discussions and service providers will have had their own plans. I'm more than happy to ask asylum colleagues in the department to provide further information to the committee about the specifics of the discussions that were held. But this is obviously a very, very complex and an effort at substantial scale. And of course, at a time when, as a consequence of the decisions that the government had taken, the number of people going into initial accommodation was increasing. So decisions, a whole variety of decisions needed to be made, including sourcing significant amount of additional accommodation in order to be able to accommodate people.
Yeah, I get that, but the point here is that these folk were already in accommodation. But one of the other decisions that you had to make was about whether or not people in hotels should be paid any financial allowance. And it turns out that people were in hotels for 3 months, still are in hotels for 3 months, and they haven't had a single penny paid to them. Even the accommodation providers themselves, when they gave evidence to the committee, said that this was causing real problems. What discussions did you have about that? Were those concerns expressed to you? And why did you continue to pay nothing?
So I think it's important, Mr McDonald, to note that the position with respect to support that is paid to individual asylum seekers is that's not a position that has been driven by COVID-19. The position is that if someone is in full board accommodation and all of their needs are met, that payment is not made. The position with respect to that £5 payment is one that has been stable for some time. I believe certainly that ministers have said that they have heard the message around, particularly at the moment, questions around self-determination, and they're happy to consider those. But the
point from 19 days,
the point about the apologies, sorry.
It's that. I understand that that's a general rule, but the target for initial accommodation is 19 days. Now, I think it's bad enough to leave somebody without any money to spend for 19 days, but for 3 months, that is a significant loss of autonomy. Why wasn't the Home Office proactive about this?
So the Home Office has been dealing with its service providers a whole range of needs of service users. The Minister has said he has heard the message about autonomy and he's prepared to consider that position. And I take the point about the fact that some people are in initial accommodation for a substantially longer period at the moment than they would normally be. And that is why the Minister has said he's happy to look at that point.
Okay, I just think it's too slow. And a final question on something which I also think was too slow. Why did it take the Home Office something like 5-6 weeks to decide that it was 5 or 6 weeks after lockdown to decide that it was no longer appropriate for in-country asylum applications to be made by travelling to Croydon? The Home Office still required people to travel to Croydon until late April to access asylum support, did it not?
So there are a number of centres. So there were a number of things that were put in place. There are a number of centres that were made available. I think we eventually had 7 centres available for people to be able to travel to register their asylum claim in country. Up until that point, if people could get to Croydon, they could have gone to Croydon within a number of weeks. Then in-country asylum claims were made possible in a wider variety of locations. But
the question is when that happened. My concern is that the lockdown was announced on the 23rd of March. If the department had been scenario planning, that should have been ready for then. It was the end of April. Folk were still having to travel to Croydon from wherever they were in the United Kingdom, basically, to access the asylum system. Isn't that just
if they wished at that point to register an in-country asylum claim? Of course, the Home Office also needed to put in place its own arrangements to be able to undertake face-to-face and counter-service services safely for its customers. And in keeping with many government face-to-face services at that point in time, there were adaptations that needed to be made and changes that needed to be made in order to allow for that safely, both for potential asylum claimants and for Home Office members of staff. But I can absolutely assure you, Mr McDonald, that the hope from the moment of from the moment that we had to, like everybody else, adapt our working practices, and indeed for many weeks before that, absolutely the Home Office was working to ensure that it could continue to provide its services as effectively as possible for as many of our service users as possible.
Okay. Thank you. Tim Loughton.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Rycroft, you are obviously relatively new to the department, so perhaps you can give a fresh set of eyes and views on what's wrong with the department. What are its weaknesses that you've uncovered so far?
Well, I think there are four. The first is that it's not joined up enough across the department. The second is that in the past it has been too closed to advice coming in from outside. The third has been the need to, if you like, reset relationships between ministers and officials. And the fourth is that as the fictional sitting in limbo demonstrated, that not every Home Office caseworker on the front line feels empowered to take decisions. So part of the cultural change agenda that I'm interested in is to put the four things right. And there's an easy mnemonic in that those four things spell out home of Home Office. So be more holistic, more open, to be ministerially led, and to be empowering in terms of leadership. So those are the four big things that I'm interested in doing in this department in terms of the overall culture. And I think probably most people out from outside the department would say one or other of those things are important. My first impression since coming into the department has been extremely positive. You know, there are 35,000 civil servants in this department doing an absolutely fantastic job, many in extremely difficult circumstances. If I can pay tribute to them, I would like to do so. You know, this is a Department of State stuffed full with brilliant people who are very committed, totally committed to the mission of keeping our country safe, of keeping our borders secure, and protecting some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And I am convinced that we can use the Windrush report and everything else going on to drive forward that approach.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm always slightly concerned when deep-set cultural problems are distilled into a four-letter mnemonic. So perhaps I can quote back some of the parts of the Windrush report. You've obviously joined at a rather turbulent time for the Home Office. The Windrush report, apart from the horrific revelations about how that particular issue was handled, I think probably more concerningly really lifts the stones in the Home Office and reveals some pretty torrid things that have been happening. So some of the quotes from the Wendy Williams report, with which you are only too familiar: the culture of disbelief and carelessness, ignorance and thoughtlessness, that the Home Office must open itself up to greater external scrutiny. I think you've mentioned that already. But to change its culture to recognise migration and wider Home Office policy is about people, and whatever its objective should be rooted in humanity. And perhaps quite alarmingly as well, in the introduction of her report, during her interviews with senior civil servants, she said that they showed ignorance and a lack of understanding of the root causes and a lack of acceptance of the full extent of the injustice done. That is really alarming, isn't it? Do you think there are people in the Home Office who are incapable of being re-educated, retrained, recultured into understanding that they're dealing with real people, with real life stories, that they got badly wrong? And if not, are some of those people going to have to leave?
No, I don't think that people in the Home Office are incapable of being retrained. I think that quite the contrary. I see a department that has read and digested and is already acting on the brilliant and very powerful report that Wendy Williams did into the lessons to be learned from the Windrush scandal. And I think coming into this department, because I arrived on the Monday after the report came out the previous week, I feared that there might be some defensiveness amongst officials in the Home Office, but I have not spotted that at all. I think quite the opposite. I've been extremely impressed by the ability of the department, including senior officials involved on that side of the department, but actually spreading across the whole of our system. Been extremely impressed by people's ability to really get under the skin of what Wendy Williams is saying. You know, there are 30 recommendations. It would be relatively easy to slip into a sort of box ticking exercise and have a plan for each of those 30 and to track them in a Gantt chart and to report back and so on. And of course we are doing that, but we're doing something much bigger than that as well. And that is to really understand the big cultural things. Of course, they can't be boiled down into an acronym, but under each of those things is a huge amount of work, and of course they're going to take time. So, you know, each of these shifts is a very significant shift of culture, and as you know, cultural shifts take time.
But don't you think some of the conversations we've had already this morning, and some of our correspondence with the Home Office, doesn't reveal a culture of openness or preparedness to be more transparent and recognise some of the problems that have taken place well beyond Windrush, as you've heard from Mr McDonald, in some of the asylum cases as well. What is it about the Home Office where it appears to be insular and inward-looking rather than a people-friendly department? Because perhaps more than many other departments, it is dealing with some very vulnerable people who need to be understood and supported rather than interrogated and assumed to be guilty of whatever it is they may or may not be guilty of.
I think that's an extremely good challenge. You put your finger on something which is an important consequence of this cultural reset that we are both talking about and that Wendy Williams is talking about. From when I was outside the department, I thought that it was something to do with the mission and the purpose, and especially having come from international development, where there is an extremely strong sense of passion and purpose and mission. But actually, as soon as I walked in here, I realized that there is just the same level of commitment to the mission of this department as there was to my previous one. So that is an extremely strong foundation to work on. I do think that the openness is absolutely key. I think Wendy Williams was right about that. I do think that there has been, perhaps because of the political sensitivity and the amount of risk that this department carries, a bit of an inward-facing culture, and I've been again extremely impressed by the way that, if I can say so, the old hands in this department, people who've been here for a long time, have read and digested Wendy Williams's lessons and are already acting on them. Already, we are seeking to shift the culture to be proactively going out there to talk to communities. Not just the ones who are going to agree with us, but precisely the representative communities who are not going to automatically agree with what the Home Office is saying. The way, for instance, that we have sought to deal with the Windrush compensation scheme hasn't been perfect, and I'm sure we're going to come on to some of its imperfections shortly, but it has been done with that community at its heart. And you're absolutely right. I think the mantra around here needs to be faces, not cases. It is about real people, quite often at extremely vulnerable moments in their lives, and their touch point with the state is quite often through the Home Office or one of our implementing partners.
Okay, so need to make sure. So can I ask you, Mr. Rycroft, specifically when the Home Office's new purpose, mission and value statement is going to be published, and then perhaps to come on to Shona Dunn, who's obviously been there longer, and perhaps for you to make a comment on the relationship between ministers and senior officials, and where the responsibility for this lies. Certainly, I think there have been fewer changes in Home Secretary than there have in the International Development Department that you've seen, Mr. Rycroft. So surely ministers should have provided some degree of consistency. And of course, then we had the big issue in front of this committee that led to the resignation of the then Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, because of clear misinformation that had been flowing between ministers and senior officials as well. So what is where does the fault for this lie in terms of with ministers and the executive direction, or with the senior officials who are running on a day-to-day basis the Home Office and its activities? Should we go to Shona Dunn first and then come back on the cultural statement, Mr. Rycroft?
Thank you, of course. And as you rightly point out, I've been here since late October 2018, so right around 6 months or so after the Windrush scandal had first come to prominence. In response to your question about the relationship between ministers and senior officials in this department, it is a very close working relationship and a very professional working relationship across all of the very, very difficult things, as Mr. Rycroft has said, that we do on a daily basis. Wendy Williams' report, I did a great deal of evidence gathering and consideration of the question about the contributing factors to Windrush, and I haven't got the precise words that she uses in front of me, but I know them pretty well. That she referenced both the need for officials to have done more to draw out the potential implications of the decisions that were being made and to consider the potential impacts of those decisions on the individuals, the people behind these cases, and for ministers to have challenged officials more on those points. So I think Wendy Williams herself has been very clear that there were lessons to learn all around on this topic, and those lessons go very, very deeply to the heart of what we need to change about this organisation going forward. And I hear your points about the culture of disbelief and ignorance and thoughtlessness. I think there are also, in addition, I think there are some sort of basics systems issues that we must address as well. So the issues around the over complexity of our systems, the legacy systems that we work with that make it difficult for our excellent caseworkers, our very committed caseworkers, often to get the information they need and to be able to make decisions in the way they would like. So I would say that there are absolutely lessons at every level for this organisation coming from Wendy Williams' report, and we are, as
okay. Can you just comment on the relationship with the ministers point? Do you think? Okay, but do you think that there is a problem in the Home Office, not uniquely but particularly, of the relationship between ministers and civil servants, particularly senior civil servants? Certainly, in the last Labour government, Home Secretaries came and went like London buses, and there was a sort of feeling that there'll be another one along in a minute, so it doesn't really matter. Now, that's happened less in the last 10 years, and certainly you had one secretary, a Home Secretary, whose tenure was 6 years. But then her successor was thrown under a bus by a senior civil servant in front of this committee. Do you think that is an unfair representation of the relationship between ministers and civil servants, or is it still a problem?
I do not perceive a problem between ministers and the senior civil service of this department. As you say, in all departments, there will be high points and low points in that relationship or in individual relationships. The issues that this department deals with and the impact those issues can have on the lives of individuals mean there is a particular flavour often to what we do. But I perceive and having been in a number of other government departments, I perceive no particular and specific issues that go specifically to the heart of this department on the relationship between ministers and senior officials.
Okay, Mr. Rycroft, finally on the statement of purpose and mission.
Just before answering that question, I just want to strongly agree with what Ms. Dunn has said about the relationships between ministers and senior officials. And I mean, obviously, I can only comment on how it has felt since the 23rd of March, which is the day that I started. But I have invested very significantly in ensuring that we have an extremely strong set of relationships between the Home Secretary and her ministerial team on the one hand, and myself and the Executive Committee on the other. You should ask her whether she agrees. But from my perspective, I think we worked extremely hard to reset that, and we have a very close working relationship. My job as permanent secretary has at its heart to ensure that the department is set up to implement the decisions of the Home Secretary, and that is what I and the senior official team are doing. the Home Secretary and I set up a change programme jointly for the future of the Home Office, looking at how, not just how Windrush needs to be dealt with, but how COVID is changing the environment we're in, how our exit from the EU has changed and will change that, and how other trends in society will be changing the big things that we deal with here, like migration, the border, policing and crime, and so on. And that is a future programme looking at that context, how our priorities need to change, and what the culture is going to be needed in the department to deliver in that environment. In terms of the mission of the department, we are following up that Wendy Williams recommendation quickly. We have done a lot of work on what our mission will be. I'm not yet in a position to announce it to the committee, but we're very close to doing so. That's really a statement about why the Home Office exists. What is it that we do that only be done by the Home Office? Secondly, there will then be a vision, which is a forward-looking description of the direction of travel. And then thirdly, there is the values, which is much more associated with our culture. And we're just spending a bit of time on the second and in particular the third to engage with staff, because I think the mission can be sort of set at the top and just decided on, but the others I think will benefit from some staff engagement, which is why those haven't come out yet. And I can't give a timetable, but we're talking about a relatively small number of months.
Thank you.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Chair. My question actually follows on quite neatly, I think, from Tim's, and I'll address it to Matthew in the first instance. One of the things that I found quite striking about the Williams review is her comments on indirect discrimination. And there is a fairly damning passage, and I'd just like to draw it to your attention, where she says that some of those that she interviewed were unimpressively unreflective. And when they were asked, I'm sorry, paraphrasing now, but when they were asked about Windrush, they only seemed to understand discrimination in quite a narrow context, in the sense of direct discrimination, and were sort of oblivious to the idea of indirect discrimination. She said, little awareness of the possibility of indirect discrimination or the way in which race, immigration and nationality intersect. And she points out, not unreasonably, and I'm sorry, this question may sound more barbed than I intended, but I would be interested in your answer. She refers to the case of Essop in the Home Office that was the Supreme Court decision on indirect discrimination, and it's probably fair to describe that as the most significant decision on indirect discrimination in the last 25 years. A massive case which the Home Office lost. Do you consider that there is a sort of basic lack of equalities understanding among staff? I mean, it seems a reasonable inference from her report. And if so, is there anything specific in the field of kind of more detailed equalities discrimination training that you have in mind or is part of the thinking?
Thank you very much. A very important set of questions. And again, we're absolutely on it in terms of digesting what Wendy Williams is saying and really understanding the big points that she's getting at. And the Home Secretary has already responded in terms of accepting the recommendations in full, and we'll be back in the House before the summer recess with some more detail on that. And then in September, she'll be setting out at the 6-month point after the Wendy Williams review in detail where we're going with the recommendations. So on this set of issues, I mean, starting with your first point about an unreflective department, I mean, I have a very high ambition for this department to be reflective, self-aware, and constantly learning. I think there's continual improvement is important in any department. However good a department is, it can always get better, and the way to get better is to learn from experience, not just from mistakes, but also from when things go well. As you know, it's a very large department. It's complex. As I've said already, there's a lot of risk that we carry in this department, but we do need to get better, I think, even better at learning from successes and failures from one part and spreading the successes across the whole department. Since I started, race has been an extremely significant issue for our country, for our society, as well as for this department, partly because of the Windrush report, partly also after George Floyd's death through the Black Lives Matter movement. So we've been putting a very large amount of time and effort into really understanding the lived experience of our colleagues from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background, what they think of the discrimination, direct or indirect, within this department, and how we can set about putting that right. And we've already agreed and published internally a set of actions to dramatically change the picture in relation to our staff. And then finally, in relation to risks of indirect discrimination in our policy making, if you like, we and all of the government departments, of course, have a public sector equality duty. And that's something that, for my colleagues and I on the Executive Committee, is an extremely important duty. And we need to make sure that everyone within the department knows what that duty is and knows how to fulfill it, knows how to implement it. And as your question implied, training is going to be an important part of that. There is already a good package of training, but we are looking to see what more can be done in order to ensure that our public sector equality duties are being fulfilled effectively.
Thank you. Chair, I'll pass on to the next questioner.
Can I just follow up on this, because it's not clear to me what you're actually doing that's changed. If you've got a good programme already, of training already, but that good programme has led to where we are and to the Wendy Williams conclusions, which are quite damning. Can you give me just a specific example of something that you're now doing that's different from what you were doing before, that would tackle those concerns about indirect discrimination, about the institutional ignorance about race that Wendy Williams referred to?
Well, there's all sorts of things that we're doing, Chair. So I'm just to give some examples that each individual one might sound quite small, but I assure you they are part of a bigger package. So we are all educating ourselves on questions of race, which is an important thing for each of us individually to do. We are reviewing our performance management system because some of our Black colleagues in particular feel as though there is some inbuilt discrimination against them in that. We are changing our representation in terms of governance structures, so ensuring that we have diversity where it doesn't exist at the moment. We are requiring diversity on panels in terms of promotions, and we are looking at the whole suite of training that we do, as I've just mentioned, to ensure that where improvements can be made, they will be.
So, Roger, when you say looking at training, is there going to be comprehensive training for every member of staff? And if so, by when will you have that put in place?
I mean, the Chief Operating Officer might want to comment in a moment on that in detail. But I mean, this is part of Wendy Williams's report. She encouraged us not to rush with our response to the recommendations. So she gave the Home Secretary deliberately 6 months until September to come out with the detail about how we're following that up. So certainly at that point we will be able to answer your questions. But I think that the work that the human resources colleagues are doing on the training is happening at pace. They're just not in a position yet to announce what change. But Charu might want to add to that.
Sure.
Thank you. So, Chair, there are two specific things we're doing. One, there is mandatory learning on diversity and inclusion that we request every staff in Home Office to do, and particularly for the senior civil servants. One of the innovative ways in which we're trying to talk about race, because from external research, it suggests people don't feel comfortable talking openly about race, so just doing the mandatory learning is not enough, but adding that mandatory learning about having sessions. So we're introducing sessions for senior civil servants and workshops, which are entitled Let's Talk About Race, and we're delivering them alongside the business and community training partnership, so that everyone can talk more openly about race and we can address some of the issues you just highlighted.
And can I ask, I was struck by some of the things referred to that in the survey, the People's Survey, 41% of staff in the 2019 survey felt it was safe to challenge within the department, which is already obviously quite low. But for the immigration enforcement section, for the black staff and respondents to the survey, that was down to 32% felt it was safe to challenge within the department. Now, those are really troubling figures. So what are you doing specifically within immigration enforcement on this?
Well, this is an extremely important part of the annual People Survey, which in previous roles I've put a lot of emphasis on. And in fact, in my previous department, we had a big campaign to respond precisely to this question about safety challenge. And one of the things that I learned in that role is that it's not enough just to say that it's safe to challenge. Lots of people say that, and quite often when they say it, they don't always mean it. So, and sometimes when they say it and mean it, that doesn't always come across. So what matters is that the people at all levels of the department, particularly more junior levels, and as you say, particularly given the statistics, some of our Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff, what their views are about whether they feel that it is safe to challenge. So one of the specific things that we'll be doing on this is working with our brilliant network, which is our organisation for all of our Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff, which is actually the largest, I think also the oldest such network in the civil service. And they are helping to drive some of the changes needed in this space. I can't answer the question specifically about immigration enforcement, but if either of my colleagues can, then
well, I think maybe some further.
Chair, apologies, just very, very briefly.
Yes, very briefly.
Just who's the Director General of Immigration Enforcement is absolutely. This is amongst his top priorities. He is absolutely focused on changing the perception, the experience of members of staff within immigration enforcement. He's about to really push forward on rolling out something called OPEX, Operational Excellence, across immigration enforcement, a big part of which is designed to give all members of staff a voice, a mechanism by which they can feel they can exercise that voice. So this is very high on his agenda.
Diane Abbott.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to begin by following up on Mr. Loughton's questions to Shona Dunn about the relationship between senior civil servants in the Home Office and ministers. And Ms. Dunn, if I understood her, said everything was fine, which made me look up the Wendy Williams report. And she has a specific recommendation, Recommendation 24, and she says, the department should invest in training senior civil servants to ensure appropriate emphasis on the roles and responsibilities of officials to provide candid, comprehensive and timely advice to ministers. Ms. Dunn, could you tell me why would Wendy Williams have made that specific recommendation if there wasn't something problematic about the relationship between ministers and senior civil servants?
So, Ms. Abbott, I think I quite understand why Wendy, based on the evidence that she saw of the issues she was exploring, felt the need to make that recommendation. It's a very important recommendation. There are always ways in which we can make sure that the relationship between officials and ministers is working as effectively as possible. And given the issues that we deal with, there are often cases where we have to give very candid advice to ministers, and it's a part of mine and Matthew's role to make sure we are supporting all of our senior civil service colleagues in performing their functions appropriately. And I would argue that senior civil servants should always be open to more training on that and should always be seeking to develop themselves in doing so. I think my point is, with respect to the current relationship between senior civil servants and ministers, that relationship is a close one and a professional one, and I am seeing senior civil servants absolutely give candid advice to ministers on a frequent basis. I will continue to make sure that they get supported to do so. Ministers are very keen for them to continue to do so, and we will continue to train people as they come through to make sure they feel able to do that.
I've got a number of questions. I don't want to prolong this interchange, but just so I'm clear, you are saying that as far as you know, there is nothing problematic about the relationship between senior officials and ministers. And therefore, in effect, Wendy Williams' recommendation 24 was gratuitous.
Wendy was focusing on the period up to 2018 and the specific instances associated with the Windrush scandal. So she had a particular set of evidence that she was referring to there, and her recommendation is right in response to that recommendation, and we must act on it.
Okay. Sorry, do continue.
No, apologies. I was simply going to say I think that statement and my earlier statement and Matthew's about the close and professional working relationship that exists today coexist.
I wanted to ask a few questions that arise from the Wendy Williams report. And one of the things she said, which I think is important, was it's important for the Home Office to look beyond the Caribbean in examining the whole Windrush affair, because as those of us who have a constituent interest will know, there are people from West Africa, South Asia, who were part of that cohort that came in and were caught up in Windrush. So are you able to tell me whether you were looking beyond the Caribbean, and also whether you have or are reviewing data on other Commonwealth countries?
Would you like me to come in on that first?
Well, yes, because it's your...
Okay, of course. So we have absolutely been very, very interested to reach out to all of the communities that may have been affected by the Windrush scandal. We've done a considerable amount of analysis to determine which those communities might be, where they might be, and to make sure that the outreach work that we are engaged in, both directly and indirectly through community groups, is extending out beyond the Caribbean communities.
And have you reviewed the data on other Commonwealth countries?
So the historic case review, which you were referring to, of course, the historic case review was conducted on Commonwealth countries, because the historic case review was designed to answer particular questions from Parliament at the time. Wendy has made a recommendation, which you'll be referring to, which is the recommendation that we consider our response to the NAO's recommendation on that point. And the Home Secretary has said that she's said that she's accepting the recommendations, and we will consider that. So we are currently looking at means by which we could meet that recommendation, and the Home Secretary will give further information on that when she makes a further report to the House before the summer recess.
Thank you. Mr. Rycroft, I noted that you said towards the beginning of this evidence session that, having come in to the Home Office, you were extremely impressed with what you found. I have to put it to you, there's a lot of people who've been victims or tried to work with victims of the Windrush scandal who might not agree with that. So I wanted to ask, first of all, am I clear that there will be what Wendy Williams asked for, a comprehensive improvement plan in 6 months?
Yes, there absolutely will. And thank you very much, Ms. Abbott, for the opportunity to add to what I was saying earlier. I mean, what I've been impressed by, amongst many other things, well, two things really that are relevant to your question. One is about that sense of mission and purpose, which I think in any organisation is such a crucial foundation on which you can then build. And the other is this willingness to learn and to accept that mistakes have been made, to apologise profusely for those mistakes, and to get to the heart of what went wrong. And I think that is what the Wendy Williams report is all about. And the thing that I've been particularly impressed by is the non-defensive nature of the response by officials in the Home Office and indeed ministers.
On the question of the apology, it is true that the Home Secretary did apologise, and it was very profuse. But the other thing Wendy Williams said about the apologies is that the test of how real the apology was the amount of fundamental change. So I wanted to ask, has there been a review and evaluation of hostile, or you might say compliant policies with external experts, which will be published? Mr. Rycroft?
Yes, we'll be doing all of the things that Wendy Williams has recommended. The Home Secretary has said that we have accepted in full the recommendations. So everything that she has set out, we will be taking forward. I just want to say to the committee that cultural shifts take a very long time in any organisation. I think particularly in one as large and as complex as the Home Office. So I don't want to give any sense of sort of declaring victory. What I want to I hope give a strong signal on is the direction of travel that ministers and officials are now embarked upon in this department, and we want to work with this committee as we make those necessary shifts. So we'll be reporting back very regularly, of course, the Home Secretary to the House and us to this committee on each of the different parts of that cultural reset, including, as we've already discussed, the training, including the reviews, including hostile environment, and yes, the answer to your other question about are we going to be doing this with people from outside, and that's this openness point that we keep on coming back to. That I can't speak for the culture here before, but what I can speak for is the culture that we are seeking now, which is to be open and to be proactive in going out to the communities who are most affected by the policies and the operations that we run here, and to engage with them, putting them at the centre of the design for the future. And I think that's going to be a very significant part of our response to Wendy Williams's review.
With respect, Mr. Rycroft, talking in general terms about the direction of travel is easy. Answering specific questions is hard. Can I ask you another specific question? One of the things that Wendy Williams recommended was the reduction of the complexity of immigration nationality law, immigration rules and guidance. Have you begun that process?
Yes, we have. I think the Second Permanent Secretary would be a good person to hand over to.
Yes, Ms Abbott, we have started that process. As you know, we received the report on simplification of the rules some months ago. We have started that process. We've also established a board of experts to support us in that as well. As you know, it is a very extensive task. It is one that we need to undertake as swiftly as is safely possible to do. It's critical from my point of view, as Matthew has said, in terms of changing this organisation from the inside out. Simplifying the rules is a critical part of that. It's also critically important to underpin good processes and systems going forward. So we have started that process. It is an iterative process, but we are seeking external support in making sure we do it well.
And finally, to Mr. Rycroft, I think this is a general question about the processing of compensation claims, but I'm going to raise a specific case because I've been asked to raise it, because it typifies what has gone wrong. So this is a case about a lady called Jocelyn John who was wrongfully sent removal papers. She panicked, as a lot of people did, and left, and ended up homeless in Grenada. She was sent removal papers even though she'd been in the UK for over 40 years, and she provided the Home Office with 75 pieces of evidence. She waited a year, she applied for compensation, she's been waiting a year, she's had an interim payment of $7,500, but you keep asking her for more and more pieces of evidence. And Jacqueline McKenzie, who's a solicitor who's done a lot of Windrush cases, she's dealing with over 200 at the moment, what she says is the key issue is that people are struggling to get the evidence needed and they're not given adequate support. She says, and I'm quoting her, that you're treating people with contempt. Can it be the fact that you're asking for all of this evidence and people are struggling to provide it, that so far only 60 people have had compensation, which totals £360,000 in all?
Well, thank you very much. And I won't comment on the details of that case, but of course, we thank you very much for that detail. We will look into it and respond to you in the appropriate way. But if I can make a couple of general points about the scheme. I mean, as the Home Secretary has said, she wants to speed things up, but it is worth noting that this is a complicated thing to do, and we are determined to get it right. And by getting it right, we mean working with each individual claimant to ensure that all of the compensation that they are entitled to is paid. So yes, the numbers look as though they are extremely low in terms of total cases that have come all the way through the system and out the other end with a final payment. But there are many more cases where there has been, for instance, a partial payment, and now there is an ongoing discussion about additional payments. And I just encourage people to understand that we have designed this scheme deliberately with representatives of the community who will be using it. And we are determined to take our time, not to rush, not to make mistakes, and to assure that everyone in the end gets the full compensation to which they are entitled as a really important part of our response to the scandal.
Mr. Rycroft, I understand what you're saying about taking your time, but I know the Windrush cohort. They are my parents' cohort. They're an ageing cohort. And what concerns them and the people that are working with them is whilst you take your time, there will be persons that in the end will not get the compensation they're entitled to because they have in fact passed away.
Well, let me just repeat that we will continue to work as fast as the circumstances permit with the claimants, with their legal representatives, trying to make it as simple as possible. But it is by its nature a complex scheme that requires individual decisions that are absolutely about the individual case, the individual faces behind each case.
But this is a real concern for us because the 4 cases that we raised in our Windrush report over 2 years ago, 2 of those individuals have now died before they can get any kind of payment or compensation or any redress for the injustices that they faced. So can you tell us how long is it taking? What is the average length of time it is taking to actually give people an offer?
Well, I don't think on this occasion that an average is a particularly useful number because each case is so different and the numbers of actual cases are small. But the average does compare broadly favourably with other equivalent schemes.
But what is it?
And as I said,
what actually is the average?
I might ask the Second Permanent Secretary to come in here.
So, Chair, as you would imagine, with 60 payments made at the end of March, it is possible from management information to be able to determine that figure. It is potentially extremely misleading. And extremely...
I'm asking for 2 factual questions, and I've asked for those already in writing. 2 factual questions. One is, what is the average length of time for those who have had an award given? That should be a factual question for those 60 people. We recognise that won't cover everybody, but for those who've had an offer, what's the average length of time it's taken for them to get an offer? And secondly, what is the average length of time that everybody currently on your books has been waiting? And I accept, again, neither of those will fully capture what is happening, but it would still be useful to get that factual information. Can you tell us the answer to that now?
I can give you the current management information that I have, Chair. I know the Home Secretary would be very keen for me to be clear that if we provide any information of this sort, it cannot amount to anything that people would regard as a target or a service level or a service standard, because
I understand it's not a target. I'm just asking for the factual information.
Absolutely. So currently, the management information we have, the time for those whose claims have been completed, it's around 9 or under 9 months, and the time for all of those that have been in the scheme is under 8 months. But those figures are not verified. They come from raw internal management information. They are not figures that we would wish anyone to rely on or to draw any conclusions from.
Okay, and then we obviously raised a series of individual cases with you. There are some significant discrepancies between the response that we have received from the Home Secretary this morning on those cases and the information that we've been given, which I think we will want to follow up with those individuals and then come back to you on. But there are a couple of questions that I want to just raise specifically now. On the first case that we raised with you for the person who had served in the armed forces and put in their claim in April 2019, so well over a year ago, the response we've had from the Home Office is that this case is now in the final quality assurance stage and compensation offer will be made imminently. Well, he was told that pretty much that information in January. So what does imminently mean? What is this final quality assurance phase and how long does it take? Because from his experience, this seems to have involved a 6-month wait from when he was told that his case was in the final stages.
So, Chair, of course, the length of time that quality assurance phase takes will depend on the issues that quality assurance process raises, and I entirely understand the frustration and concern. This is one of our very earliest cases, and is also quite a complex case in terms of the number of heads under which the claim was made. And I think, as the Home Secretary has explained, one of the things that is really important to do in a scheme like this is to make sure, particularly in the early stages of the scheme, that we're making proper comparisons as we go through early cases to make sure we're making decisions consistently and safely and to the best benefit of the claimant.
Okay,
so there have been a number of issues that will have arisen in this case during the quality assurance phase that are being worked through, and I can absolutely assure the committee that the team will be working to resolve those as quickly as possible.
Can't he just be offered an interim payment, at least something to recognise the injustice and how long he's been waiting?
So I think if there are aspects, as you know, the approach that the team has been taking is where there have been aspects that could be settled fast for the benefit of the claimant, where there was a very sort of simple and clear determination that could be made. Interim payments have been made. As an interim payment hasn't been made, to the best of my knowledge, in this case, I assume there are good reasons behind that. But as you say, Chair, I think there's been an offer to go through at an even more granular level of detail these cases individually with you and other committee members. Very happy to do that. If an interim has been made, there will have been a good reason.
Can I move on to the fourth case that we raised with you, where the response from the Home Office says that caseworkers have been attempting to make contact with the applicant, whereas the information we've been given suggests she hasn't heard anything from the Home Office at all. When we say attempting to make contact with the applicant, what does that mean? Responding in writing to her lawyer, ringing her up, writing directly to her? What are the attempts that have been made to make contact? Because obviously they haven't succeeded.
So I have, the information I have is that attempts have been made to contact the claimant by phone with the number provided, but that has so far been unsuccessful. A request was made probably earlier this week, I think, to the claimant's representative for alternative contact details.
Okay, only earlier this week, once you had the letter Only earlier this week, once you had the letter from us asking about the case.
So as I say, the information I have in front of me is that the team have been attempting to contact the claimant by phone with the number provided, but so far without success. So that was only before this week.
Okay, can you follow up that case and just find out how many attempts by phone that has meant, and what happens in these circumstances if people can't get through on the phone, whether other efforts are made in case there is some issue with numbers having changed or inaccuracies in the records as well. And then can I raise the case of Andrew Bino with you, who we also sent you his details, and who was refused an initial application for urgent assistance, even though he was about to become homeless, only finally received support from the urgent assistance scheme after I raised it directly with the Home Secretary earlier this year, and is now still facing extreme financial difficulties and is having to apply all over again for additional financial assistance. Your scheme for urgent and financial assistance doesn't seem to be working very well if someone who is clearly facing serious financial difficulties is having to apply multiple times and not getting the support the first time, even though they clearly needed it, because he then became homeless.
Thank you, Chair. The information I have in front of me is that, and again, more than happy to share greater detail with you beyond the detail that's been put into the Home Secretary's letter. The first request for urgent and exceptional support was withdrawn. The second request, we had some made effort to receive additional information associated with that. And that information didn't come to us, so that was declined. And the third request, as you say, I think was received on the 17th of February, was granted on the 28th of February. I understand there was an error made by the bank, which meant that those funds didn't go through to the 10th of March. But I'm more than happy again, Chair, to follow up, provide you, I've got pages of caseworker details here, to provide you with that further detail.
And what's your estimate of when Andrew Biner will finally get a compensation offer? Just a sense of time. Whether you have an estimated timescale, would be fine.
I do not have an estimated timescale. There are a number of issues that are still being worked through with Ms. Bino. So I do not have an estimated date for that. I think, as the Home Secretary's letter said, caseworkers are in the process of reviewing some aspects of previous criminality and will make a final offer as soon as that has been completed.
Why are you asking for information beyond reasonable doubt?
So the approach that is provided. So, apologies, Chair. I realise I didn't answer your question about the urgent, the application process for urgent and exceptional payments as well. Just to say on that, the team, and I reiterate the offer that I know has been made. We would very much like to make again for the committee or committee members to go and visit the team either virtually or personally and see how these things are done. The team is very, very focused on direct support to the individual concerned. So when an individual comes forward, a lot of support is put around helping an individual through the process of whatever the issue may be by the vulnerable persons team and through the urgent and exceptional payments process. And so I'm distressed to hear, whenever I hear that there is an individual who fears they have not been given enough support, because it is absolutely the intent of the organisation and the team to do that. On the point about the evidence requested, this is, of course, a scheme which is funded from taxpayers' money, and therefore it's of course incumbent on us to make sure and have set out in the scheme, which, as Mr. Rycroft has said, was very carefully constructed to put the claimant at the heart of it, have set out the evidence that we will require. It's inevitable that a degree of evidence must be sought in order to support those payments.
Beyond reasonable doubt feels like quite a high threshold, and feels like that's likely to be demanding several different additional levels of information, given that this is a group of people who have already experienced considerable injustice, distress and trauma at the hands of the Home Office, being asked to provide multiple pieces of information to prove the same thing. If you want to prove beyond reasonable doubt your level of lost earnings, what would count as the evidence that would tick that box?
The variety of different ways, of course, in which that information can be provided. It can and has in certain cases come directly from the employer. It's come from the individual. We have received evidence via representatives from a number of different sources. We, of course, also go to HMRC as well. And the team themselves that are working on this do a lot of the legwork to try to bring together those sources of evidence. So it will depend on the circumstances of the individual case and the background to that case, but the team work with the representatives and the claimant to make sure that they are sourcing that evidence and doing as much of the legwork as can be done.
And does everybody have a named caseworker that they can keep in touch with and that will keep in touch with them about the position on their case?
It won't necessarily be the same caseworker at all points, but there is a very, with the number of cases concerned, there will be very largely consistency of contact. One of the things that we have been, as Mr. Rycroft said, obviously one of the things that we are doing at this point, the team is doing at this point now that a number of cases have gone through, and those early learning stages in terms of consistency of decision making are working through. We will start to see an increase in the speed at which decisions are made, and we're also returning to the question of the care that we provide around the communications with the individual claimants. So early on in the process, we were making an awful lot of contact with individual claimants, and in some cases, claimants were saying, look, sort of don't get in contact with us if you don't have a substantive update to make, which is an entirely reasonable request on their part. We're now moving, and will do over the coming weeks as things move at a greater pace, to make sure that we're providing monthly updates, that we're in, we're providing text updates or basically using the approach that individual claimants would like us to use. So very much focusing our care to the claimant around what the claimant would wish.
Okay, it would be helpful if you could consider further whether people should have a named caseworker that they can keep in contact with, because it is a pattern of the cases that we've received that people are saying to us that they are left in limbo again, that they don't know what is happening on their case, that they're told that they're getting they'll be getting an offer shortly, very soon, that they're in the final stages, and then they don't hear anything at all for months, that they don't know who to contact, they don't have a named person to contact, and therefore it's somebody different. And also that they're being asked sometimes to provide the same information twice. And for them, given that they've already been through difficult experiences with the Home Office in limbo, being asked repeatedly to provide the same information, it's really important to ensure that this experience of applying for compensation doesn't put people off applying for that compensation or support just because they can't bear to go through any of those kinds of interactions with the Home Office again because of the way that they've been treated previously. So it would be really helpful if you could look further at the points we will come back to you on these individual cases and give us some further answers, but also to look again at the personal point of contact for people and also how long it's likely to take for each of these cases going further. Stuart McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. First, just a quick question on the evidential standard beyond reasonable doubt. During the passage of the compensation bill, I think the Minister agreed to go back to Martin Ford to seek his advice on that, because it does stick out like a sore thumb that you would apply the criminal standard of proof here. Do you know if the Minister has done that and has engaged with Mr Ford?
So frequently engaging with Mr Ford on where there is evidence of for adjustment to the scheme. I'm not aware of in the round decision or discussion at the moment about reducing the evidential standard. No.
Okay, it'd be good if you could check on that. But
I will.
In the sixth case that was sent, and you mentioned it in relation to another case, you spoke about the process of reviewing an applicant's previous criminality. If I cause wage loss to somebody or whatever else, I don't get out of paying compensation because they may have a criminal record or whatever else. Why on earth is it appropriate for awards to be reduced because somebody has a criminal record?
So this is fundamentally, this was a policy judgment that was made at the time the compensation scheme was constructed. The position in the scheme is that the scheme essentially reserves the right to reduce the compensation payment based on previous serious criminality. That is the judgment that ministers made at the time, and based on a assessment of where it's appropriate to use taxpayers' money to provide compensation to an individual who may have conducted serious criminality.
It would be important, I think, for the Home Office to monitor very carefully the number of awards that are reduced on those grounds, and indeed the number of award claims for wage loss that are refused because it doesn't reach that standard, because we'd like to see that.
Of course, it's not the case that it's a blanket policy. It is a position which allows that to be taken into consideration. Absolutely.
And my final question is, I mean, you used the word complicated several times this morning, and the Home Secretary has as well. Wouldn't things move faster if people were able to have legal aid for applications, and people could much more widely engage solicitors without having to rely on pro bono solicitors all the time?
Mr McDonald, if there are cases that you are aware of where people were not able to access the scheme, or felt that they were not able to be sufficiently well represented in the scheme as a consequence of that, it would be very good to hear about them. Of course, the costs of representatives are one of the things that can be covered through the scheme itself. And it's certainly the case that there are some cases, for example, where the caseworkers are not only considering obviously the costs of representation now, but the costs of previous representation as well. So if there are cases that you are aware of where people are struggling to access the compensation scheme for that reason, I would be extremely interested to hear of them.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, some just very quickly factual questions about the Windrush scheme before we move on to the wider issues, and apologies for the timing. How many cases have been waiting for more than a year?
I don't have that figure, Chair. I can find that figure for you and report it to you separately. I don't have that figure immediately.
That would be really helpful. That is one of the questions we have previously asked, I think, in correspondence, and so it is factual information we would expect to get. Secondly, can you confirm that less than 5% of people who have applied have been given an offer? Is that still correct?
So as at the end of March, which is the last verified information we have, there were 1,275 claims and 60 payments have been made.
So it's just less than 5%, is that correct? Okay, so
at the end of March.
End of March.
So as the Home Secretary indicated in the House previously, those numbers are now higher, more than £1 million worth of offers have now been made.
So when will we have confirmed updated figures?
Currently, Chair, we are publishing data on a quarterly basis. The data from the end of May, the end of June would be analysed and available at some point before the summer recess. Okay. We will let you know when we're able to publish that. I expect to be able to see it at the end of July.
And do you expect it to be the case that 90% of claims will still not be resolved?
So it depends at that point in time, Chair, how much the overall claim number has gone up. I would expect the number of offers to have been made and the number of claims paid to have increased significantly. I cannot tell you what the percentage of the overall claimant number at that point will be.
And what's your progress in appointing a permanent independent advisor for the compensation scheme? You said, I think, in February that you were launching a recruitment for a permanent independent advisor. Where's that process got to?
I will have to let you know that separately, Chair. Apologies, I don't have that information in front of me.
Okay.
I'll absolutely get back to you on that point.
Okay, given that you knew we were going to be asking about Windrush and the compensation scheme, it slightly surprises me that do any of the three of you know what is happening about appointing a permanent independent advisor to the compensation scheme?
No, but we'll write to you, Chair, on that. OK. Fine. Doesn't sound like there's been a huge amount of progress on that. It would be very helpful to know if an advert even went out on that. OK, we want to move on to some wider issues. Diana Johnson. Diana, I think you might still be on mute. Try again. We still can't hear you. I'm going to go to Andrew Gwynne while we try and resolve the technology, Diana. Andrew Gwynne.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to extend some questioning onto wider immigration issues, because the Home Secretary has told this committee that as of the 15th of June, more than 15,000 individuals had received a visa extension from the Home Office. How many extensions are you expecting to grant in total?
So, Chair, as I say, we've got a very large number that have been processed. We don't have a total number, a total expectation there. We are ready and willing to support any number that come forward, but we don't have a total number against which we are tracking.
Of course, this comes to the point about the decision not to implement automatic processes for granting visa extensions to eligible individuals. What difficulties would alternative means of granting extensions have presented to the Home Office?
Apologies, Mr. Gwynne. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. We would have, in terms of the visa extension for those unable to leave by the end of July, those able to leave by the end of July, it would have been very difficult for us to determine who required that service, which is why it wasn't an automatic service and why we've been processing them as they have come forward.
OK, well, to move on to one of the specifics, the Home Secretary told the committee that there were practical challenges in extending the offer of visa extensions, for example, to social care workers. Can you outline the process by which the Home Office ascertains which health and care workers are eligible for extensions, and explain to us why this process couldn't be replicated for social care workers?
Apologies, Mr. Gwynne. I now understand your question better. My fault. So the extension to as I think has been explained and set out for the committee before, the majority of individuals in the social care sector operate in a sector which is quite diffuse, where we have sort of upward of 10,000 separate and individual employers, where individuals who operate in those settings often have a status which allows sort of general status for work, and therefore we wouldn't necessarily be aware of what sector they were working in. So to be able to, obviously for NHS workers and for the other categories we've extended that offer to, it is possible for us to engage with employers to determine who is eligible for that extension. It's a much more complex and, as you say, practically difficult proposition for the social care sector for those reasons.
OK, so the government originally stated its intention to open key routes in the new immigration system from this autumn, ahead of the full operation of the new system from the 1st of January next year. Is that still the intention of the Home Office?
It is, Mr. Gwynne.
Has COVID-19 affected the planned implementation?
So the future borders and immigration system is a very high priority of this organisation, and one of the things that I have been very clear on, and that ministers have been very clear on throughout COVID-19, is that we needed to do everything we could to protect the progress of that project. Inevitably, there has been some change in working practices because there have been a significant number of people working on that programme who have had to start working remotely. So we have had some challenges to overcome, but as of now, and we've had to do some rework and reprofiling of the timeline, but as of now, it is certainly still absolutely on track to start from the 1st of January, and for us to open some of those to open some of those routes in the autumn.
Okay, so when do you intend to publish some of the further details, or even the full details of the new immigration system?
So that the decision for the Home Secretary at the appropriate time to do that. And there's a great deal of engagement and communication going on with a large number of people who will be impacted by and have an interest in the development of the scheme. So there's lots of engagement going on. The final publishing of guidance and plans will come later in the year. I cannot give you a precise time.
How much will visas cost in the new system?
So the question around fees is quite a separate question. The fee lists at the moment are as they are, and ministers will consider those fees in the way they normally do from time to time.
And what will the required level of English be, and how will that be measured?
So the English language tests so there are varieties, for the future borders immigration system. There are a variety of requirements. There are requirements around skill levels, requirements around salary, and around occupation. The English language test requirements are as they are. If you require more information on whether there will be adjustments to those, I can provide that, but that's not a key aspect of the way the future borders immigration system is being devised.
Okay, and then will work visas tie an individual to a particular job and employer? What happens if skilled workers who enter the UK with a job offer switch employers? Will they lose their right to live in the UK, or will visa holders be required to inform the government if they change jobs?
So the full details will come forward, but the bones of FBIS are as I've described. They are around skill levels, income, and occupation. Those will be the key aspects of those, and further details will be published when full guidance it comes out later in the year.
And then lastly from me, Chair, why will EU citizens receive e-visas and non-EU citizens physical documents? Will EU citizens be able to request a physical document in addition to their digital visa if they want that?
Essentially, I think the headline answer to your question, Mr. Gwynne, is that we are, as far as possible, wanting to move as a system towards digitising our processes, and to make sure, as far as possible, we are making it that the more we can move towards systems where we rely less on physical documents and more on digital documents, both the more secure and more reliable our systems will be. So there are a number of different ways in which people can evidence digital status and digital, where they've got a physical document. There's a number of ways in which they can demonstrate that digitally. The reverse will also be true, but where we're providing an e-visa, we would not generally seek to provide a physical document as well, unless there's a very particular reason why someone would require it. So there will be ways in which they can demonstrate that, but we would not seek to provide a physical document except in very specific circumstances.
Okay, thank you.
We'll try and hopefully see if we can connect to Diana again.
Hopefully. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, great. Good.
Sorry about that. I know time is very pressing, so I just want to ask about the EU settlement scheme and a particular issue of that, which is relating to children in care of local authorities or those who are care leavers. Now, I understand the Home Office have done a piece of work to establish the numbers of children and young people that would be affected. I haven't seen where that number being published anywhere. I wondered if you could just tell me how many children would be eligible for the scheme, the EU settlement scheme, please.
Ms. Johnson, I don't have that number in front of me. I'm more than happy to get that number for you. I think the critical thing to say about this particular issue, though, is it is one of the issues that we absolutely note as being an area where we need to make sure that our outreach is effective and that we make sure that those individuals are given every support needed to make sure that they go through the scheme. So I'm more than happy to get you the number, but you're quite right to highlight the issue. It is an issue we are very focused on. We've got a year to go. We need to make sure that in that period of time we're reaching out to those cohorts that we know are need additional support to come through the scheme, and we will absolutely do that as an organisation.
So the Children's Society recently published some information about this. They think about 11% of children, EEA children, have applied through the scheme so far. So that leaves a large number of children who haven't. And I'm really concerned with the pressures on local authorities and social workers, particularly with COVID-19, and the lack of specialist immigration advice, because often these children may have very complicated backgrounds in terms of knowing where they've come from or where their parentage is from, etc. So what specific things are you going to do? I think some guidance has been issued, but what more can the Home Office do to ensure that we're not faced in a few years' time with another Windrush scandal if these children and young people have not received the immigration status that they should and they deserve? And I think most members of Parliament, as corporate parents along with local authorities, are very conscious that we have a duty to these children.
Absolutely correct, and I completely agree with that point. Of course, there's a lot of support around the EU settlement scheme. There's obviously the resolution centre that can provide additional support and guidance, and frequently does, to help people through the process. There's also a great deal of resourcing that's been put into supporting organisations to reach out to communities that will find it harder to engage with it and to make sure that barriers are removed.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to...
These are children.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but they're the children where we, as you say, we need to reach out to the organisations that are supporting those children and make sure...
I'm going to have to interrupt you. Given the evidence we've seen about how low the level of applications are from those children, what would be very helpful is to hear from you within a month's time of what you have done. So not what you will do, but what you have completed within the next month that has made those contacts and that is increasing those applications. I'm really grateful for your time this morning. Unfortunately, we have to close at this point because the room and technology needs to be used again. But thank you very much for your time. Particularly, we have a series of further follow-on questions. I would particularly press you, we want some accurate information on the scientific advice that was given around the border decisions. We have asked these questions repeatedly. If you cannot tell us the answers, we will just have to assume that you had no scientific evidence behind your decision to lift the isolation restrictions on the 13th of March. But it would be very helpful to hear from you what advice was given at each stage, what advice was commissioned. We will also have to assume that you did not commission any information on the number of people likely to be coming into the country, either in March or in June, who have COVID-19, unless you tell us otherwise, because we've circled these questions for a long time and not got any answers. I look forward to hearing you on that, and also from some of the follow-on questions on the individual cases that we have been raising. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Order.